Afghanistan is a region known colloquially as the graveyard of empires. The British and the Soviets, despite being respective regional superpowers, have, during a period known as the Great Game, tried and ultimately failed to invade and subjugate the various tribes of the region. The ultimate factor with Afghanistan's defense is its geology, whether it be the mighty Sulayman Range of the south, or the stitching of mountains and deserts between Balkh and Herat. Afghanistan is a region not easily accessible to the modern army. The inability for armies, especially modern armies, to get themselves through tight mountain passes and support a wide front on land easily defended through guerrilla warfare, leads to the inability for an army to progress effectively, and in the case of Afghanistan has kept it safe from two of the mightiest empires the world has ever seen. The British have tried thrice to penetrate and establish meaningful control over this area. The first war was an attempt to intervene in a succession dispute between two emirs, and partially a result of a worry of Russia potentially influencing the emirate. British forces moved in to replace the current emir with one more loyal to the British crown. Despite managing to occupy the capital, Kabul, in 1839, British forces were repelled and harsh winters forced a retreat, wherein tempted Afghan tribesmen ambushed and all but annihilated the remaining unit. Although the British sent their Army of Retribution in, tactically beating the Afghan army in Kabul in 1942, ultimately their first war closed with an Afghan strategic victory, with the British withdrawal and the original emir restored to the throne. The Second War between 1878 and 1880 actually led to the establishment of a British protectorate in Afghanistan, after the decisive Battle of Kandahar. However, in 1919 the Afghans broke free again in the Third Anglo-Afghan War, leading to their return of sovereignty. So, this shows the defensive capability of Afghanistan, but what about its offence? Well, geology is not kind to Afghanistan. It may be extremely defensible, but the land is very poor. It has a very inextensive river network, with no ability to feed large populations, and the wrong geography to concentrate populations. Infrastructure is hard to construct, tax collection is harder, and so on. Afghanistan is not a prosperous region. It never really has been, although of course this is exaggerated by the current wars within it. That said, it has never been a particular economic hegemony, often just a backwater that trade routes and caravans might traverse through. This has historically driven Afghanistan to be a long-time rival of various Indian powers, raiding or often even conquering coveted rich land. One such invasion by Babur of modern-day Uzbekistan, who became suzerain of the Afghans early into his life, even prompting the establishment of the hugely successful Mughal Empire, which, ironically, did become an economic hegemony. A problem for India is that although it may be rich, the Afghani mountains foster an extreme warrior culture, which allows it to fight on the flat lands of places such as Punjab and Delhi, with often devastating cavalry-based shock tactics, which have often collapsed like paper the largely infantry-based armies of sultanates such as the Delhi, with some prime examples being Timur's battles. Timur was technically Turkic-born, but did control Afghanistan, such as the Siege of Batna Fortress 1398 and the Siege of Delhi, also 1398, in the Timurid invasion of India, battles which ended in catastrophic slaughter and heavy looting for the Indians. An important thing to note about the Afghani soldier, be under whichever regime it may, Iranian dynasties, fragmented tribes, the Mongols, etc., was always largely unprofessional and followed a definite tribal, semi-nomadic structures. This is true for most of Asia beyond that land civilized. A lot of these men have no identity and likely are just in it for the plunder and the riches and the fame instead of a passion for their nation or their king. But enough about these barbarians. If one looks to the borders of the Indian subcontinent, one sees particularly rough and navigable terrain. To the west, aforementioned mountains and deserts. On its coast, a navigable ocean, but not one that can facilitate overseas conquest. To its north, the Himalayas, some of the tallest mountains in the world, and to its east, Burma, which borders India with high-reaching hills and has dense jungles on the other side of them. India has never attacked outwards. There is one time I will briefly cover with the Chola Empire, a nation with a very hard-to-uncover history. Sources conflict wildly on the extent of this empire, but it is generally agreed that the west coast of India, parts of Bengal, the island of Sumatra, and the Malay Peninsula came under either direct control or close influence of the military or mercantile forces of the Chola. The Chola started out and were for a long time a relatively small Dravidian tribe in South India, coming into existence around 400 to 300 BC, and presumably being of the Hindu faith the whole time. Their nation was set about the Ganges River, and so was relatively fertile and prosperous. This Hindu faith is crucial to explaining the abundance of Hinduism in Indonesia, albeit an abundance that has declined to later Islamic influence in the region, but one that can still be seen to a small extent today. In the 10th century, the Chola, from what we can gather, instigated war against its neighbours, slowly taking over the surrounding kingdoms, with India and especially southern Indian states, being very used to trading and thus doubly marrying maritime adventures, invaded eastern Indonesia, toppling the Buddhist Srivijayan Empire, a move which has provably dissolved the Buddhist influence in mainland Indonesia, especially on Sumatra, as we can see in the modern day. With this newfound territory, the Chola created a highly centralized administration, capable of extracting large amounts of wealth from the extremely rich Malacca trading area, wealth which could be transported along the coastline the Cholas had influence over, right into their Dravidian heartlands, funneling vast amounts of money into southern India. The main effect this control had, however, was the cultural impact. Both Indonesia and Indochina derive names partially with the prefix Indo, demarking their cultural influence from India. The island of Java, for example, was a relatively isolated place post and pre-Chola, but it retained very firm Indian hegemony and was later the birthplace of the Majapahit Empire, a nation which rose up in the 13th century and was staunchly Hindu. However, all things come to an end, and Indonesia was slowly brought under the heel of Islam, which dominates the region to this day. Although this is in stark contradiction to how I said India never expanded outwards, it is an important lesson in how geology can facilitate cultural expansion. Indonesia is a region which is, clearly, easily influenceable by all around it. Indians, Muslims, the Chinese, the Dutch, the British have all had stakes in and have had differing levels of cultural influence on the region. If one were to take a boat ride down a river into the heart of the island of Borneo, truly what can be called a backwater and undeveloped jungle-covered island, one would find unadministrated, perhaps savage tribes. But one thing that does penetrate: the mosque, the church. Religion and influence go unhampered by the confines of geology. Military geology was, as a discipline, not around until the very end of the 18th century. Napoleon Bonaparte, esteemed consul and general of the revolutionary French Republic, implemented a corps of geologists during his invasion of Egypt 1798, a Commission of Sciences and Arts, which was comprised of around 150 engineers and 4 geologists. Testament to Napoleon's eye for detail, this corps was organised for the purpose of making French control over Egypt more efficient, which never came into fruition as the French were beaten by combined Anglo-Ottoman forces, with peace struck in the capitulation of Alexandria 1801. During this campaign was nevertheless found the Rosetta Stone, an incredibly important geological discovery, as it pioneered the field of Egyptology, the study of ancient Egyptian history. Geology unfortunately seemed to die in Napoleonic France after this, at least militarily. However, this did not stop the French-dominated German states developing their own systems of military geology. Von Raumer was a geologist who signed up to military service in the Prussian court during the 1813 War of German Liberation, quickly becoming part of the staff of General von Blücher. Various contemporary German reports state that Blücher in fact consulted Raumer prior to the Second Battle of the Katzbach, near modern-day Liegnitz, which could possibly be one of the reasons for the incredibly decisive victory of the Prusso-Russian forces against the French. Up to 30,000 Frenchmen lay dead to a mere 4,000 dead or wounded Germans and Russians. However, this early usage of geology may be a myth. The problem with German military geology is that, Due to the absence of any unified German institutions under a German state, it was much like in France discontinued. British geological ventures are much more relevant than these previous attempts. Growing demand and declining availability in limestone, an important resource of grinding gunpowder, led to military expeditions around Britain to find sources of this material. This resulted in Ordnance Survey, OS, constructing a detailed map of Ireland, and later progressing to becoming a civilian base agency in 1845. However, the importance of these innovations and the formation of new geological base institutions in Britain came into themselves in wartime. During the First World War, as it became apparent that the front would end up becoming a stalemate and that huge amounts of men would be needed to be fielded in a relatively small area, a thing that was extremely important and that will come into play later in this documentary is supply, but particularly water supply. Infrastructure for supplies of food, weapons and men were no issue due to the existing rail and road network of France, but digging wells for water was a high demand. French Cretaceous chalk was the strata which gave the best groundwater aquifer sources, so it was used, and 5 engineers with a specific task to create testing boreholes are employed. The Germans had a slightly different approach and origin to military geology. One of their first tasks was in fortification in the years before and in the opening weeks and months of the war. Something that, again, will be mentioned later in this documentary. An extremely important fortification on the Western Front was the fortress of Strasbourg. In 1914, work was done around the area to resolve problems mainly relating to supply, but also to gain good knowledge of the surrounding area. After this, geology advanced at a brisk pace, especially during the Second World War and the Cold War, terrain mapping becoming increasingly more refined over the years, particularly when computing and satellite detection came onto the scene. Today, geology has a more backseat role, as satellite cartography has long overtaken field mapping.
All roads to Russia are paved with steel. The body of Mother Russia is being fed through an arterial system of roads, railways, waterways and seaports, into which is being poured
Army
additional means of
supply is an
sustenance.
integral part of maintaining an army's ability to function on a fundamental level. Supply is the process of bringing forward food, weapons, fresh men, and a host of other needs to the front line, but also the ability to keep it going. When an army doesn't have supply, it starves, and with no hope of escape, i.e. in an encirclement, such as Leningrad 1941 among others, demoralization, mutinies, and the general inability to fight is sure to ensue. Typically, soldiers were expected to live off the land. This was a common practice for armies for a long time in human history, thousands of years until the massive standing armies of Europe came about in the 18th century, as well as things like the advent of rail for use in mass transportation. Especially before the advent of the wheel and wagon supplies, such as those used by the Romans and their enemies, troops would roam the countryside and loot whatever they could for themselves, such as crops for food or money to buy it.
Army that would eventually conquer 12 million square miles.
An excellent demonstration of living off the land would be the Mongols. This military was organised into a horde, a structure which was essentially a large unit of cavalry, wherein each man would have 4 horses, such that he could switch between them in order to avoid exhaustion and cover the most distance. These horses were often mares, and so could provide milk if the need arose, although due to Mongols fighting in Central Asia, predominantly on steppes, large flat areas of land with low-hanging vegetation, the soldiers could often feed themselves. There was no need for supply lines as such, as certainly no wagons could be dragged in time to fulfill the needs of the warriors, and since the Mongols' entire strategy lay within the idea of lightning-fast conquest, this was an impractical idea. Part of military supply is bringing forward soldiers and new recruits. However, the Mongols would often recruit people in the lands they conquered with the promise of vast riches and wealth and plunder. This was a solution often associated with very nomadic armies, where conquered peoples who may also have lived nomadic or even semi-sedentary lifestyles join the army of the Mongols, as they are suited to similar cavalry tactics and have no reason to fight for the preservation of a nation they have previously been a part of. This was effective for the Mongols as it would potentially lower the risk of armed rebellion, as more capable warlike men from a region were out fighting already. And it also eliminated potential manpower deficits, which could have easily happened in Mongolia. I can't say I know what the population of Mongolia proper was in the 13th century, but since it's only 3.3 million in the modern day, one can assume fairly low. The Mongols would often take advantage of terrain and climate. For example, during the Mongol invasion of Russia, the Kievan Rus at the time, saw the Mongols using frozen rivers as quick methods of transport, much like a road would be used in the modern day. The Mongol army would send out lightly armoured, quick-moving scouts to search for terrain like this. As the Mongols preferred flat, even ground to fight on, this led to effective situations such as in the invasion of Novgorod, where the forces of the Novgorod principalities could not organise their forces into one unit, instead being dashed about in smaller numbers. But let's rewind now to 1223. General Subutai with a dedicated army of Mongols invaded the Kievan Rus, quickly feigning a retreat and forcing the princes of the region to pursue them. The Mongols planned this carefully, however, leaving loot and prisoners along the way to make the pursuing princes think they were winning. The princes, each leading different armies and going at different speeds, reached the Kalka River at different times. Once one army crossed, the Mongols wheeled round and attacked, going in for the slaughter. And a slaughter it was, according to the Novgorod First Chronicle, where the rest of this information comes from, written between 1016 and 1471, which could, of course, have exaggerated medieval numbers. Up to 90% of the Russia's 60,000 strong force was wiped out. The last part of Mongol logistics to be covered here is Mongol communication. Of course, it relied on horses, called the Yam, or the Ertur, and was a relay system of horses with messengers stationed every 200 to 300 kilometers. Like any basic relay system, the idea of this was to send communications from the capital in Karakorum to the army as quick, if not quicker, than the army's conquest were progressing. The Mongols were truly one of the most, if not the most, fearsome armies to ever roam the planet, and their tactics and organisation as well as utilisation of land was a huge part in their enormous success. Supply developed over the years since the medieval era into more refined systems which had to support far larger armies. As has been covered with the First World War, supply was not a huge issue, as the front was static and no real flexibility in scheduling had to be accounted for. German U-boats did make life hard for Britain as it meant they could import less food, and although rationing certainly happened on mainland Britain, it never really crippled the country. By the Second World War, however, warfare was far more global and truly logistics was an enormous requirement, especially due to the exponential development of tanks, planes and navies in the interwar period. World War II logistics covers the immense, constantly moving front lines of Europe and Asia, but also the naval invasions made in various parts of the world, as well as aerial support used throughout, and most crucially the resources required to support them. Each of the major powers in World War II faced different situations. Germany, for example, was fighting over land with incredibly developed infrastructure, which facilitated the famous blitzkrieg into France, then later into the Soviet Union, which was less developed but is on the Great Northern European Plain, allowing supply routes to be relatively easy and flexible. Because of the German doctrine of mobile warfare, that is, using motorized equipment like trucks and cars, supply was quick and importantly fresh men came in efficiently, facilitating the build-up of troops to a maximum of 189 divisions on the Eastern Front in August 1943. The Soviets had a bit of an easier time, having practically all the resources they could want, having oil, tungsten for artillery, chromium for tanks, and most importantly steel for guns. However, most of this mineral wealth is buried in the frozen wasteland of Siberia, potentially making delays in how quickly it can get to the industrial heartland nearer to Moscow and then to the front line. It did only fight on one front, but it had little support from the Allies. No ports were open for it to receive supplies, and the Allies literally had to stage an invasion of Iran just to get the bulk of supplies to them. Supplies could come in through the Russian Far East, however they would have to be transported over all of Siberia. Britain and the United States have arguably the hardest time. Britain does have concentrated mineral wealth, but not enough on its island to support the army it needed. According to RGD Allen, Britain supplied 69.5% of its munitions, and the rest was from abroad. As a result, America and India were used heavily, predominantly for food. Reportedly 22 million tons were imported from various sources. A huge requirement, though, was the need to transport this over sea. To make an invasion in Normandy in the first place required complete control of the English Channel, and the ability to establish ports in France very quickly. Japan had a similar situation where it had to extend through sea, and although the Japanese did have to contest waters, their navies operated much closer to their home islands, and thus they were able to properly stage and keep control of a vast part of South Asia until their capitulation in 1945. One important thing to know about Japan is that, unlike Britain, it's a small island that lacks resources, so it had to expand into other territory to get the resource from it. And this succeeded until their capitulation in 1945. The various situations of these nations are strikingly different, but the fact Germany was under so much pressure was perhaps the main factor in the ultimate downfall. The inability to exercise mobile warfare properly, mainly the inability to produce tanks to fight the Soviet T-34s due to the lack of oil, led to an ultimate collapse of the front and later their country. Fortifications are perhaps as important as the armies who defend and besiege them. They represent the most stalwart resistance against the zealous marauder, but also the gem in the midst of a battlefield, the zone most hotly contested by any number of sides. They can, and often do, define borders. They protect a nation from those invading from over the sea. They guaranteed property to medieval nobility who, in return for their service in erecting great walls, could reign as barons over the people within their walls. Siege warfare is perhaps one of the most complex military crafts. Great walls to keep us and them separate are never more clear than the depiction of a great civilized empire keeping barbarians out of their riches. It requires great cunning, tactics, and ultimately knowledge of terrain and geology to defeat and capture a garrison of any one fort. Fortification always lies on high ground. Before the states of the modern world, the successful tribes would always choose raised ground to settle and fortify on. After all, it's a natural defense that fends off invaders by making an assault more tricky. It makes it easier to hail down arrows and projectiles. Later on, it made artillery fire harder to concentrate, and ultimately a garrison sallying out from a fortress will much more effectively charge down their enemy if they're running them down a hill. When it comes to particular turning points in history clearly influenced by geology, one can look to the infamous Siege of Vienna, 1683, where Polish hussars relieved the fort by catching out disorganized Turkish encampments, utterly routing their position there, and ultimately being a catalyst that eventually brought down the Ottoman dominance in the Balkans, leading to the surgence of the Austrian Habsburg Empire. All this from one positioning of a fort. But to look at a line of forts, not just a single one, there are two main examples that conjure up popular imagination. One is the Romans' fortification lines all around its empire, especially the specific lime fortifications. Another being the Great Wall of China, an incredibly famous example. In the Roman Empire during its peak in the 2nd century, when it was evident that expanding further into Germania and other territories was impractical, the Romans adopted a defensive approach. One example is in Britain, where the Romans struggled so badly with the Picts of modern-day Scotland that they ended up building Hadrian's Wall, a 117.5-kilometre wall of varying height and width. A colossal effort of a project, all built with stone and protecting this relatively hilly territory of modern-day southern Scotland. Although the Picts never really got through it, it truly defined for the Romans what Rome was. Not this ever-expanding entity, but one with hard lines in the sand of where it can reach to. This is the same with the rest of the Roman fort lines, especially the ones known as limes, as I said earlier. These primarily fortified against the Germanic tribes, who were particularly fearsome in sacking Roman cities. And perhaps the Romans were right to do this. When these mighty fortifications were scaled in the 4th century, the tribal Gothic forces that moved in flattened Rome in 410, and went on to form in 476 the Ostrogothic kingdom, completely toppling the Western Roman Empire forever. The Lower Germania limes, being built around the 1st century and standing until the 5th, partially ran through what is the modern-day Netherlands, when especially at the time it had extremely boggy land and numerous small streams, making the fortifications far more effective in halting the especially cavalry-based armies of Germania. Generally, Roman forts were made out of anything around, generally stone for the larger ones and wood for the temporary or smaller ones, but potentially also the Roman invented puzzolanic cement, made from adding crushed volcanic ash to limestone, much stronger in resisting physical attacks than stone, often using a river as a natural defence and dotted about with earthen banks and ditches. But a far more famous and influential wall is the Great Wall of China. With work started as long ago as the 7th century BC, various Chinese dynasties built set stretches of walls, with the Ming dynasty of the 14th to 17th century building the most. But they also serve a political purpose, where the first unification in 221 BC was the first time a centralized emperorship ruled China. Part of any centralized realm is an identity, which certainly came in this case from splitting off what was barbarian wasteland from what was prosperous civilization. Today the Great Wall serves only a touristic purpose, but back in early modern times especially it was instrumental in proving the legitimacy of the emperor. If too many foreign armies amassed at the border, it was reason for concern as it could easily lead to the death of China. The mandate of heaven, essentially the mandate of who should rule China, was an important idea at the time, and political disarray could be had if nomadic armies were too prominent. This happened to the Ming in the 17th century, which led to the toppling of their dynasty and the rise of the Qing. Other fortifications in history have served important purposes, but this is an example where an identity itself has been defined by the protection it brings.